Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through a reflex arc for your GCSE biology. Now it's really important that you know a perfect example of this because it can be applied in a few different contexts in the exam.
The reflex arc. Neurons, or nerve cells as we've seen already, come in three main forms. We have sensory neurons, which connect receptors in sense organs to the central nervous system. We have relay neurons, which connect sensory and motor neurons through the spinal cord. We have motor neurons, which connect the central nervous system to effectors. So all of these neurons are neurons, they're nerve cells, and although the one on the far right, the motor neuron, looks most familiar, they all have the same structures. So they'll have the cell body, which has the nucleus in it and contains it. They'll still have a cell membrane, they'll still have cytoplasm inside. And although they look different, they still all have those structures of animal cells that we can recognize and label. So in the sensory neuron, we have the receptor at one end. So the receptor is probably in a sense organ. And then the long neuron or nerve cell will then connect to somewhere in the central nervous system, so the spinal cord or the brain. The relay neuron is a neuron that actually sits within the spinal cord, so it connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Okay, so if a sensory neuron isn't connected directly to the brain, it'll be connected to a relay neuron in the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord neuron, the relay neuron, will connect to a motor neuron. And so the motor neuron is the one that connects from the spinal cord, the coordinator, or the central nervous system in the brain, to an effector, which we know could be a muscle or a gland. Most of the time when we're talking about nervous responses, it will probably be a muscle. So nerve cells conduct electrical impulses along their axons. So that is their long, thin part of the body, from the cell body to the very ends. And you can see here I've put an arrow, so an arrow going down for each one to show you the direction of the impulse travel. There's ways I like to remember which neuron is which. So sensory neuron's easy to remember because it's the one that will be connected to the sense organ or the receptor in a diagram. So if you've got an eye or the skin or an ear, whatever it is, a sense organ, then you need to have that part where it's attached to the sensory neuron. The motor neuron, think movement like a motor in a car. So the effector is normally a muscle and normally it contracts and results in movement. So that's the one the motor neuron is attached to. And the relay neuron, think like a relay race. It runs between the two other neurons. So it runs between the sensory and the motor, or it runs in between the spinal cord, however you want to remember that way. But that's how I remember which neuron is which and to be able to identify them in diagrams. Where a nerve ends and joins to another neuron, there is a gap between them, a small gap between each neuron. So here I've got my relay neuron and attached to a motor neuron. They're not actually touching, the very sort of fine branched ends are not touching each other. There's a gap, a very small gap, and it's known as a synapse. So I've kind of zoomed in and you can see there the slight small gaps between the sort of fibrous branched parts of each neuron. There's a small gap and I've circled them, and these are synapses between the neuron. And you can have multiple synapses between two neurons. If we look in a bit closer, this is kind of the terminal end or a bulb of one of those synapse branches or the end of one of the neurons. And then you can see the small gap in between, which is the synapse. So this gap here between this purple part, which is the end of one neuron, and then there's a gap, and then this purple part is the start of the next neuron, the branch. So we've got this little gap here, and that is one synapse. So we need to be able to describe and explain how an electrical impulse travels from one neuron to the next across the synapse. So first, an electrical impulse will arrive at the end of a neuron, so at the end of one of these branch points. Then a chemical called neurotransmitter is transported in vesicles So you can see I've got vesicles here, which are just little kind of pockets of membrane that contain the neurotransmitter, which is a chemical, and they move towards the end of the synapse of the neuron and they are released. So they fuse with the membrane, the cell membrane you can see here, and they kind of empty what's inside the vesicle out into the synaptic cleft, which is what we call the gap. Then the chemical or the neurotransmitter diffuses across the gap, so diffuses from high concentration to low concentration, and it binds to receptors on the membrane of the next neuron. So you can see here, we've got diffusion happening, and then we can see here it's binding to one of these receptors. All of this chemical neurotransmitter will come and bind to all of these receptors on the next membrane. And then the binding of these chemicals to this membrane sets off another electrical impulse in the next neuron. So we've gone from an electrical signal coming in to this neuron to that producing a chemical signal, which is then diffused across this gap. And then that has triggered the next electrical impulse in the next neuron. So we've got electrical to chemical to electrical. So remember, it's involving diffusion. So you might be asked about diffusion in this circumstance, but as long as you make sure you say the word diffused when you are describing, use this language exactly as I've used here. You say it diffuses. You don't say it moves or it transmits or anything. You just say the chemical diffuses and then you will get that mark. And this whole process is known as synaptic transmission. It could be presented in different ways. You could see a diagram that looks like this. It could ask you, how does an electrical impulse cross a synapse? Or how is a synaptic transmission? How does it occur? There's different ways. But if it mentions a synapse, if it mentions a junction or a gap between two neurons, this is what it's talking about. Okay, so let's have a look then at reflex responses, or the reflex arc. Automatic nervous responses, which happen so fast that you do not have time to actually think about them happening, are known as reflexes or reflex reactions. These do not involve the conscious part of the brain, so you don't think about doing these, because if you were to use your conscious part of the brain and think about it, it would be too slow. That's how fast these reflex reactions are. You're born with a lot of these. It's an innate sense that we have when we're born. And this is because the reason we have these reflex reactions is to try and keep us safe. So instead of using the brain, which would be too slow, the spinal cord becomes the coordinator in these responses. So we bypass the brain and we just use the relay neurons and stuff in the spinal cord. The idea of a reflex reaction is to help prevent damage to the body and to try and keep you alive. There's some specific reflex examples. This is not just, oh, I'm jumping out of the way of a car, because in order for that to happen, you would have had to see and hear the car, which would have then passed that signal to your brain. And then you would have decided, that's unsafe, I'm going to move out of the way. These are not those types of responses. These are ones that you do not have time to think about. They happen automatically without your brain being involved. So things like blinking if something comes near your eye. So like flinching or blinking if your brain thinks something's coming near to your eye. Knee-jerk response, which is what's pictured here. So when you are a child, normally you'll get this reflex tested at the doctors. They'll bash just below your knee with a little hammer, and that should make your leg kick out. And that's partly to do with trying to help keep us stable and upright if something was to hit our legs. The pupil response to light, so when you go into a darkened room, your pupils dilate. If you go into a bright room, your pupils constrict. That's to try and make sure that you can see better in the dark, or you stop too much light entering your eye to damage your retina. Coughing or sneezing when there's something tickling and inside your nose. So if you've inhaled something and you cough or sneeze, that's a response to try and get whatever it is that you just inhaled out, because obviously it could be dangerous. And if you were to touch something really hot or really sharp with your hand or your leg, your foot or your hand, then your body will react by pulling that part of your body backwards. So if you touch a hot pan, you jolt backwards. If you put your finger on something, touch something sharp, your hand moves backwards immediately. All of these are proper true reflex reactions. Things like if someone threw a ball at you and you caught it, that's not a reflex reaction because that involves your brain. Okay, so let's look at an example. We're going to describe it and write it out, as well as I've got this diagram that's fully labelled, because you could be asked to look at and label a diagram like this. You could be asked to write out a reflex arc description in full. So in this case, our stimulus is that we have a sharp pin or a sharp needle and we pricked our finger on it. So the stimulus is going to be the prick or the pain felt from the needle. That's detected by the receptor that's in your skin. So the little red dot there I've used as an example of a receptor. The electrical impulse is then passed down the sensory neuron, or along the sensory neuron, which goes all the way through here, and it goes to our spinal cord. But we're going to have an electrical impulse traveling down, giving that information about the pain from the pinprick all the way down. At some point, we have to mention that there's going to be a synapse crossed. It doesn't matter where, because there's a couple of opportunities here, but I'm going to mention it here just so I don't forget. So the impulse will cross the synapse. You don't need to go into detail, but obviously we need to know that there's a synapse involved. And that takes it to the relay neuron, which is completely inside the spinal cord. And this is therefore the spinal cord is acting as our coordinator in this example. The relay neuron then passes the impulse. It will cross another synapse here, but we don't always have to mention it twice. You can if you want though. So the relay neuron passes the impulse to the motor neuron, and so the electrical impulse is going to travel along the motor neuron to the effector. In this case, because of what we're doing, we're obviously going to need to move our hand physically away from the sharp point. So in this example, our effector is a muscle. So the motor neuron connects to the muscle, which is the effector, and that's going to cause that electrical impulse that's traveling down there is going to cause that muscle to contract, and therefore it's going to move our arm and move our hand and our finger away from the sharp point or the stimulus. Okay, so this is one example. The only thing that would really change in different examples in the exam would be what the stimulus was and where the receptor was. So if it was, say, the pupil contraction, then obviously the stimulus would be light and the receptors would be in your retina of the eye. It would still require a muscle effector to change your pupil dilating, or it could be, for example, if it was a sound. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a reflex reaction for this series of events to take place. If it was a sound or a sight of something, you would still have the same response. So you would still talk about whatever the stimulus was, detected by whatever the receptor is, and then you would still say it travels along the sensory neuron, and then to the relay neuron, and then to the motor neuron, and then to the effector, which most of the time in nervous responses is going to be a muscle. And you can talk about the spinal cord coordinating if it's a reflex response. And you can also mention that it will cross a synapse at some point in this series.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I'll explain scratches.